Hello and welcome to another edition of the Capital Notes podcast for this week ending December 7th. I'm John Myers from KQED and the California Report. And looking back at some of the week's political news, again, something different for the podcast for those of you who listen from time to time or fairly often, which, by the way, thank you. Rather than a journalist roundtable this week, another opportunity to bring you something different that happened in the week and some insight, I think, into what we always talk about, which is the state of California politics. On Tuesday of this past week, the Public Policy Institute of California held an event, a noontime event here in Sacramento, that looked at legislative reforms and talked about the possible need for reforms of the legislature and the legislative process. And featured at this event were really some of the icons of California politics of the last 15 to 20 to longer than that, but certainly the last 20 years or so. And sitting on the stage, 4 former elected officials and 1 current elected official, and a panel moderated by the top pollster of the PPIC, Mark Baldessari. That panel included former Governor Pete Wilson, Republican, as you'll remember, former Assembly Speaker Willie-Brown, the well-known and famous Willie-Brown, the former Democratic Speaker of the Assembly, used to call himself the Ayatollah of the legislature, was in charge for so many years there in the Assembly. Former Senate President Pro Tem John-Burton, Democrat of San Francisco, who was in the legislature for quite some time and ended as a leader of the state Senate, and Jim-Brulte, the former Republican lawmaker, former leader of the state Assembly, former Republican leader of the state Senate. So these 4 former lawmakers were joined on the stage by Assembly Speaker Fabian-Nunez. And it was an interesting discussion. It was a freewheeling discussion, as you're going to hear portions of it here in this podcast. It was profound and at times profane, as I wrote in a blog posting this week. But it was interesting. I think it was real insight into the legislative process and how it works. Mark Baldessari, the PPIC pollster, began the discussion, I think, with a question about, is the legislature dysfunctional? It's often talked about that the legislature doesn't operate as well as it should. There are a number of legislative reforms that could be considered. But this was the first question, is the legislature dysfunctional? The first person to comment was former Governor Pete Wilson, who served in the Assembly at one time before he was governor. A little funny, but also acknowledging the fact that, in his opinion, yes, the legislature is dysfunctional.
Is the legislature dysfunctional? It is by times when it gets much too partisan. John-Burton, Willie-Brown, and I were in the Assembly many, many years ago. We needn't go into how far, but it's a matter of public record. And at that point, the legislature was far less partisan than it is today. And there were party positions taken on important issues, ideological issues for the most part, but also those that had a great political significance. Other times, vote your conscience, and no one particularly cared. People as smart and partisan as Jess Unruh, the famed Big Daddy, did not waste time with people who were voting something that was important to them for their district if it didn't really affect a major program that he was interested in. And I think Willie did pretty much the same thing. But the legislature has grown more partisan. It may have something to do with the fact that when John and Willie and I were all freshman assemblymen, there was a great deal more drinking in the legislature. These guys, the teetotalers, need to lighten up a bit.
Of course, Wilson got a good laugh, as you heard there, with his line. But there was a lot of talk about the way things used to operate, the sense of camaraderie that existed in the legislature that doesn't exist to the same level today, where things are much more polarized. Willie-Brown, the former Speaker of the Assembly, former mayor of San Francisco, weighed into this issue as well and said he did not think the legislature is dysfunctional. He didn't blame it on the legislature itself or the legislators. He blamed it on the system that exists now. Listen to a little bit of what Willie-Brown said he thinks the problems are.
Voting for or against a particular measure, in most cases, is a reflection of the people that elected you, the people that supported you. the people that believed in you, and the people you're going back to for a continuation of your opportunity to so represent them. Many times that causes you to be out of step with someone else who thinks the results are more important than your being representative of your constituency. I happen to believe you have an obligation to attempt to do that. On the other hand, as indicated by Governor Wilson, the leadership has the responsibility to try to fashion a result and a decision. Fabian-Nunez has the responsibility to try to help Arnold Schwarzenegger get the budget, and so it be with the other leaders in the two houses. And in that process, they do whatever is necessary in terms of fashioning that budget in such a way that they get 54 and 27 and get it signed into law. And that sometimes takes lots of pain. Unfortunately, much of that is done now where everybody in the world can see it. When Randy Collier was the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and I served as the chair of Ways and Means, and we had the private arrangement of the conference committee right in the budget with Maxine Waters and others who participated, Donald Gronsky and people like that. We produced a document that had the stamp of approval of Frank Letterman, pre-sold for budget approval purposes, no need for a big five, and of course it was an orderly process that looked good. Some would say reforms set in the early 70s, where they started requiring open conference committees, where they started requiring recorded votes, where they started requiring a number of things that inhibits good judgment. The results were, the results were that you now have this clear and present danger outfit called the legislature trying to operate and produce a result where every member is trying his or her best to protect his relationship with his or her constituency, and the results are that there's a stalemate or gridlock.
Now that's a very interesting comment. That was Willie-Brown, the former Assembly Speaker, again speaking at this event Tuesday, former elected officials talking about legislative reforms, and former Speaker Brown talking about essentially, what it really sounds like is that he thinks that the open public process of the legislature has made the legislature somewhat more dysfunctional or somewhat less efficient than it should be. Now, you can read that two ways. Of course, there are some people who think that here Willie-Brown is defending the closed-door system that used to exist, the good old boys slapping each other on the back kind of system. That may be one interpretation, and I submit it's hard to know exactly where Brown was going on this. But another interpretation could simply be, and you heard him allude to there at the end, that you've got a lot of members of the legislature now who kind of play to the public. They play to their constituency, and they are also somewhat intimidated by the constant election process of their constituency. I think that's certainly one possible read of what he meant there. Either way, this notion of crafting budgets completely in a back room, though, truth be told, they're now crafted in these big five meetings of the legislative leaders and the governor often. But, that I thought was interesting, too. Speaking of budgets, there was I thought, a pretty revealing moment with Assembly Speaker Fabian-Nunez when he talked about the budget process. This is Speaker Nunez talking about the budget process, and listen to what he talks about here about the overriding mission in that budget debate every year.